Earlier this year, I decided to dive into the Pikmin series. I've played free several times, but I hadn't touched one or two, and now that I have, I can safely say that, yeah, I'm a huge fan. The wait for Pikmin 4 was hard enough before playing 1 and 2, but after that, man, the last decade of waiting for this game to become real hit me in an instant. So I've been itching to cover this series in some form or fashion, and with the release of the Pikmin 1 and 2 HD ports finally giving us the entire series on Switch, there's no better time than now to cover them all. So join me today as I take a look at every Pikmin game leading up to 4 just to see how this series has evolved over the years. The GameCube had a lot of good first-party representation with a healthy variety, but even still, it kinda shocked me how good Pikmin still is, even compared to its contemporary Switch releases. But we'll get into the gameplay in a bit. Pikmin follows Captain Olimar returning home from a business trip. On the way, an asteroid blindsides him, making him crash land on a nearby planet with his ship losing 30 vital parts, and with it, the dolphin's ability to fly him back home. As luck would have it, the planet Olimar finds himself on has poisonous oxygen, and his oxygen tanks will only last him 30 days. With 30 days to spare, you're tasked with retrieving the dolphin's missing pieces to return home safely. But doing this on his own? Respectfully, I don't think Olimar could survive by himself. He's just a little guy. He can hit hard, but I think he'd just get himself eaten by a Bulbarb or something. This is where the Pikmin come in. These curious little creatures can be commanded to do all of Olimar's dirty work, like destroying the ecosystem by means of killing local wildlife creatures and plants. Fun! You start off with one red Pikmin, but by bringing these pellets and enemies back to its onion, a Pikmin's mother ship if you will, you can perpetuate the cycle of life and create a respectable little army. Not too far into the game, you'll unlock yellow and blue Pikmin as well, with each type having its own unique traits and abilities. Red Pikmin are impervious to fire and are the strongest of the bunch with a stronger than average attack stat. Yellows are lightweight and therefore thrown in a larger arc, which makes them useful for going up to higher places the other Pikmin can't reach. They can also carry bomb rocks, which are useful for tearing down these rock gates. Lastly, blues can breathe underwater, and that's about it. They have a more obscure ability where if a red or yellow is drowning and you throw a blue Pikmin in the water with them, the blue can save them, but most of the time it's faster to whistle at your Pikmin instead, but you know, if you're in a pinch, I guess it'll come in handy. I know a lot of people consider blue Pikmin to be just about useless, and the more I play Pikmin, the more I understand that sentiment. At the start of each day, you're almost always going to pull out a bunch of reds, given that their attack buff makes them better for defeating enemies with little fuss, and yellows are just behind the reds, because there's a lot of gates that are unbreakable without the aid of bomb rocks. Forest Naval is particularly annoying for this. That and there's a good number of ship parts you just can't get without them. Typically I avoid using them for combat though, because their larger arc makes it easier to miss the target. Blues are kind of bizarre though. I feel like the devs weren't quite sure how to justify you needing to go in the water, because most of the time you only need blues to build a bridge or carry a ship part out of the water, and after that you can immediately put them up. It's kind of funny how you can actually just avoid having to use them entirely in the Forest of Hope due to some oversights in design. For example, the bridge across the lake which you normally need blues to reach, you can just bring your reds here by having them drown and slowly swim across the water to this edge, at which point you can simply throw them up. I feel kinda bad for the blues honestly. It only gets worse for them in later entries, so the poor dudes never catch a break. Pikmin is a pretty open-ended game, with 5 areas total and 30 parts to collect within 30 days. It leads this game to having a somewhat unique feeling from a lot of other Nintendo games. By that I mean, I find it really fun to learn how to play it as efficiently as possible. Pikmin is such a fun game to watch and to play because of that, since there is a learning curve to understanding how your Pikmin work in tandem and how you can better spend your time each day. In most other games I don't think I'd care to play as efficiently as you possibly can, but I don't mind it as much with Pikmin because you're given the freedom to play it however you like and experiment with different options. But the order in which you collect each ship piece is important as well, not to mention considering all of the enemies and gates that may be blocking your path. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the level designers had a little too much fun throwing rock gates everywhere in the Forest Navel. I mean, did there really need to be like 4 of them in the immediate vicinity of each other? What kind of masochist does this? I feel like there's at least 1 or 2 annoying quirks about each area that, while they certainly don't ruin the experience, it just leaves you wondering why they made it like that. In the Forest of Hope, there's a certain treasure you may end up seeing after grabbing the Nova Blaster, but not being able to reach it thanks to a ledge blocking progress. On my first playthrough, it took me forever to figure out that you're meant to go on this side path to get there, but from a distance it doesn't even look like you're able to walk up the route. Then there's the Libra and the gates in the Forest Navel and the repair type bolt in the distant spring. Despite that, I enjoyed the areas quite a lot. It definitely helps to have played the game before so that you know what to expect, because this game can be somewhat cryptic at times. I appreciate that it's not a super handholdy game since it doesn't need to be. It teaches you the basics but then leaves you to figure out the rest. But that learning curve can be a frustrating element of the game to newer players, which is perfectly understandable. It took me embarrassingly long to figure out how to defeat the armored cannon beetle, the final boss, and how to even progress in the final trial, but whenever I came back to the game, I had a newfound appreciation for it since I had that prior experience. It's the kind of game that only gets better with replays for me. However, one thing that doesn't get better in Pikmin 1 is the Pikmin AI and pathfinding. Pikmin are so incredibly stupid in this game. Oftentimes when following you, they'll get caught on a wall and continue running at it instead of going around it, or they'll trip and fall far behind the group. Their pathfinding is confoundingly stupid, which is only made more abundant by the paths they choose to take when retrieving ship parts. Whatever path you think is the fastest, your Pikmin will go in the opposite direction and take 5 times longer to arrive at base. You have no idea how frustrating it can be to see a much quicker path the Pikmin can take, but to have them blatantly ignore it. In fact, sometimes my Pikmin have even walked past the path they're intending on taking, so they have to turn around and go back. And then there's the ship parts surrounded by water near the landing site in the distant spring. You might think that by getting blue Pikmin to carry those parts that they would cut through the water, but instead they will mill around until you've built them a bridge. Good grief, you idiots, just carried this thing out of the water, what is your problem? When I was getting the pilot's seat, my Pikmin went in the opposite direction of the base with it into the path of a bunch of enemies, only to continue circling this tree stump and go the way they could have gone in the first place and have avoided the enemies. Pikmin pathfinding is a huge issue of the game, if only because in a game about doing as much as you can each day, you're much more limited when your Pikmin are fighting against you. Another admittedly more minor gripe with Pikmin is how slow they can be to regroup after whistling at them. I understand how nitpicky this sounds, but Pikmin love to stand by and watch whatever they collect go into their onion, which gets annoying pretty fast. I've grown to tolerate it just because of how good a game Pikmin is otherwise, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't still get on my nerves at times. And now that the major negative is out of the way, I want to quickly highlight the creature designs of the game. I'll talk a little more about this when I cover the later games, but I've always loved the diverse cast of quirky creatures this series has. From the breadbug to the snagrits, bulborbs, and the Wallyhops. Apparently they had to rename them in the HD re-release, and it still doesn't sound quite right to me. My 2 personal favorite creatures are the Mamuda and the Breadbug. Just look at my man Robert, he's so peaceful. And then we got the classic Gilbert, he's a lovable little goof. Pikmin 1 doesn't have nearly as many enemies as the later entries, but I still find the ecosystem of the Pikmin planet to be a very interesting one, and it's really fascinating to see how it grows over the course of the series. But yeah, Pikmin 1 has aged very well. While it is held back by somewhat clunky controls, Pikmin pathfinding, and the general learning curve it has, if you give the game a fair chance, it gets so much better. Going into it after having played free first, I expected the transition to be incredibly rough, but instead I've come out with a greater appreciation for the groundwork Pikmin 1 sets for the rest of the series. You're given a lot of freedom to explore this game and collect its treasures in whatever way or order you want, which is certainly why I can see myself returning to this game for many years to come. But what comes next? 3 years after Pikmin 1, a sequel would be released, one that many people consider to be the best in the series. So where do I stand on it? Well, it's a little complicated, but before we get into all of that, let's go over the story. Set just after the events of the first game, Pikmin 2 sees Olimar returning home to Hocotate only to be met by his boss, the President, who tells him that his new coworker Louie met a ravenous space bunny in the middle of a job, which ate all of the golden Pikmin carrots he was transporting. As you could likely guess, these Pikmin carrots were expensive. So expensive, in fact, that the President had to take out a massive loan to pay off the debt. Unfortunately, the loan created a new debt to pay back that the company just can't afford. After Olimar drops an artifact he collected on his trip, one of the company's ships assesses its value, finding it to be surprisingly high. So the President decides to send Louie and Olimar back to the Pikmin planet to collect enough artifacts to pay off the loan, and maybe let Olimar finally see his family afterward. Honestly, as much as I want to hate Louie for this, he's just such a goofy looking character that I love him. Does this look like the face of a sociopath? With the introduction of Louie, we now have 2 captains to take control over, which opens the door to potentially a lot more multitasking. Although, if I'm honest, multitasking feels a lot more useful in the first game. In Pikmin 2, there's no longer a 30-day limit, in fact, there's no limit at all. Not that it's a huge issue, but personally it leads the game to becoming a lot less rewarding later on. Because every move you make in the first game matters, you have to divide tasks among your Pikmin quite a bit to be the most efficient each day. It's a difficult aspect of the game to a first-time player, which makes it far more interesting to replay because I went from spending nearly all of my 30 days to over half that, and other people have min-maxed the game to death, so I know much faster times are possible. Multitasking in 2 can still be plenty useful for stocking up on sprays, but it's more of a self-imposed challenge rather than a necessity this time around, which is fine, but I found it disappointing. Another reason why I felt this has to do with the locations in 2. Pikmin 2 reuses a lot of areas from 1, which I'm okay with because 2 sort of remixes elements of them so they feel distinct from their counterpart. The problem I have is that they just aren't as fun to explore. I was always excited to start a new area in Pikmin 1 because of the grand feeling they give off and always knowing that you have a bunch of new things to discover, puzzles and some mini-bosses as well. Pikmin 2 just doesn't hit those same notes for me. One major reason for why I feel this way is because of the new caves. Caves are essentially dungeons you explore floor by floor to find the mini treasures they hide. Enter a floor, clear out the hazards and or enemies, collect the treasures, and find the next sub-level entrance to repeat the same process for about 5 to 7 floors on average, with some outliers. One interesting quirk about the caves is that the daylight cycle doesn't apply when you're inside of them, so you're free to explore them at your own pace. On paper, this is a very cool idea, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired. Caves are little more than enemy gauntlets you have to clear out before you're able to do a clean sweep for treasures. Credit where credit is due, they get a bit more interesting over time, introducing some new enemies and hazards such as the new elemental hazards, poison and electricity, which are both neat new ways to be traumatized for life. Speaking of hazards, I was having a perfectly nice day. The caves love to hate you by throwing troll hazards in, like the occasional falling bomb rock at you. Later in the game, there are some ridiculous traps like the Hellspawn bomb rock dweevils which pursue you. Who hurt the dev team? It's generally a good idea to take one captain to scout out a sub-level to trigger any traps, and if an accident does occur, then there's no shame in resetting since the game saves in between floors. Traps are particularly obnoxious because there are some that only activate when you have Pikmin with you, but the worst kind are the traps that trigger when Pikmin begin carrying a treasure. You honestly can't leave your Pikmin for 2 seconds without the risk of them all blowing up. The only purpose these traps serve is to catch you off guard and or tick you off, which forgive me if I find it the tiniest bit obnoxious. Sure, after the first few times you expect to see some traps, but I hate having to watch my Pikmin 24/7 because the boogeyman jumped out from the ceiling while I wasn't looking. If my Pikmin are dying to an enemy I forgot about, I'm okay with that because it's clearly my own fault, but I shouldn't be punished for not knowing another enemy would spawn after retrieving a treasure. And I would understand it better if we were already introduced to the idea of 2 captains to control in Pikmin 1, but we weren't. The caves are different from above ground exploration. I understand that, and I can tolerate it better now that I know what's lurking in the depths, but that doesn't mean I like it. It just feels a little weird to me for 2 to actively discourage utilizing a new mechanic like this. There are some particularly evil enemy and hazard combinations in the caves as well, so be prepared for a massive Pikmin casualty at some point. Many tragedies have occurred at the hands of these demons. All of this to say, there's a lot about the caves that can make them very frustrating, but on replay I found myself enjoying the early caves that I hated initially, so if I had any advice, I'd say to be patient. You have all the time in the world to explore them, so carefully plan out each move and you should be good, barring any sudden diversion thanks to a trap. I will say though, I don't feel like the game ever takes the potential of the caves far enough. The caves have this gameplay loop which gets stale very quickly. There's not enough variety here considering just how many there are in the game. Why couldn't we get some caves with unique challenges? Growing up, I heard so many people point to the submerged castle as their favorite or most memorable cave, and I think it's pretty clear why. From the moment you enter, the submerged castle gives off an eerie vibe, more so than the other caves thanks to its foreboding music. On floor 2 of the submerged castle, after you reach the donut treasure, you're introduced to the water wraith, an invincible creature who hunts you down, eager to steamroll you and your Pikmin. If you spend more than 5 minutes on subsequent floors, you can hear it drop down somewhere, and let me tell you, that is one of the few times a game has ever made my stomach sink. Suddenly having that "oh crap, I gotta get out of here" moment makes this cave my personal favorite for the sheer urgency it causes. I almost got all of the treasures in the submerged castle on my second playthrough, but I spent too much time on the 4th floor, and hearing it drop down was enough for me to decide, yeah, no thanks. I just can't say that for many of the other caves though. I don't mind the simplistic nature of the early caves, but the more I played, the more tired I became of them because they never changed significantly. I have to clarify significantly because technically the caves are always changing thanks to them being mostly procedurally generated, but this is more of a negative than a positive. Handcrafted levels are much more fun and interesting than most anything that procedural generation can churn out. Not to say that I dislike procedural generation, just that it has its place, and that place isn't Pikmin 2. It would have been refreshing to see more caves have gimmicks to make them feel more distinct. Maybe in one you'd only be able to bring a handful of reds, or in another you'd be on a timer to collect the treasures and reach the exit before it erupts. Simple things like that would have made a world of difference for the caves. If you wanted to take it even further, it would be cool to have a couple of literal dungeons, complete with deeper puzzles, locked sub-level entrances you'd have to find keys for. There's a lot of potential here. It's such a shame because I wanted to like the caves. There's a really fun idea in here somewhere that just isn't fully realized. I enjoyed them more in my second playthrough, but I think I'll always prefer the areas of the first game. I am curious to see how Pikmin 4 expands on the caves though. Judging by the demo, I'm hopeful but still skeptical. But Pikmin 4 is already out, so I guess we'll already know the answer. Moving on to the Pikmin, we're introduced to a few brand new types, purples, whites, and bulbmen. Bulbmen are just the most lovable little goofballs I've ever seen. They're impervious to all elemental status afflictions, very useful. The caveat is you can't bring them out of the caves. It's unfortunate because I love bulbmen, but I guess they're just too stupid to jump into the geysers. It makes them good fodder if you need more purples or whites though. They're far from overpowered, but their invincibility to all statuses on top of the fact that you get them for killing the leading adult bulbman makes them my favorite. Is this considered kidnapping? Purples and whites are only found in caves as well. For appropriately colored candy pop buds, you can trade your other Pikmin for them. White Pikmin are impervious to the new poison hazard, can poison enemies if consumed. They're also able to dig up hidden treasures and walk the fastest. Purple Pikmin are pretty infamous for being the most powerful Pikmin in the game, boasting a higher attack stat than that of the red Pikmin, alongside the ability to stun enemies, and they have the carrying strength of 10 Pikmin. On my first playthrough, I was too afraid to use my purples since I was saving them for a treasure later in the game, but this time around I finally got to see how much power they pack. I can confirm it's pretty ridiculous. Considering just how much the caves hate you later in the game, I think it's only fair that you get to have an OP Pikmin. On the flip side, I found white Pikmin to be confusing. You don't get a whole lot of them, so if it wasn't for the poison geysers and hidden treasures, I wouldn't see a need to bring them out really ever. And then there's the blues. Man, blue Pikmin are only barely ahead of the whites because Pikmin 2 does no favors for them. There are several lakes you can straight up drain, which trivializes them a lot. Water hazards were hardly ever an issue because of this, so I just don't see what blues or whites add to the game. Reds, purples, and yellows have a much wider variety of abilities that cover the general exploration and combat purposes. Yellows, for example, are impervious to the new electric hazards, which insta-kill alongside their ability to be thrown higher, so I always have a reason to carry them. Purples, They speak for themselves. Whites can carry treasures faster, but how useful is that when you're in a cave, a place with no time limit? Also, the poison hazards are not much different from a fire geyser. I think the devs knew this because there are a fair number of walls with poison geysers ingrained in them. I wanted to like whites, but their addition feels redundant and only adds some minor annoyances. It's expected that you'll need certain Pikmin for certain jobs, but white Pikmin felt like more of a burden given how I had to be even more careful to make sure they don't get chomped on because I might miss out on a hidden treasure. Pikmin have had some other changes as well. For one, they're much more responsive, so finally you don't have to wait for them to stare up at their onion for 5 seconds as the sacrifice they offered gets consumed. That and their pathfinding is far better. I'm not sure if that's because the areas don't leave as much room for shortcuts as the first games, but it's much appreciated. Pikmin are also less likely to get stuck on walls since they redirect themselves on contact, and they bunge up when crossing bridges. These few changes alone are huge for efficiency. I mean, the pathfinding alone drove me up a wall in the first game. I do wish 2 did something about the bud and petal Pikmin falling behind though, because I had to stop constantly to make sure they caught up. There's also the new sprays you collect via nectar or berries. Ultra Spicy Spray makes your Pikmin more efficient, so they'll carry items faster or attack faster temporarily. Ultra Bitter Spray on the other hand freezes an enemy for a short time. Considering how easy the sprays are to grind, they're incredibly useful. I found myself stockpiling them for any particularly difficult bosses, but it can also be fun to freeze a Bulborb just because you can. Idiot. Speaking of, I think it's a shame that 2 doesn't really have any mini-bosses above ground. Still, the bosses we get are certainly creative. The Empress Bulblax, Water Wraith, Man at Legs, a very memorable cast for sure. Man at Legs is probably my favorite because for some reason someone fought to give a Pikmin enemy a gun, and that is just incredibly funny to me. There's also a wider variety of enemies, and even more for me to hate. The little dweevils that steal treasures are obnoxious, not to mention the bumbling snitch bug, craning dirigibug, aka the sky demons, or even the decorated cannon beetle. A lot of these enemies aren't so bad once you've already encountered them, you know what to expect and all that, but thanks to a few little quirks, even basic enemies can be a little more obnoxious. One of my favorite quirks is how in the event of certain cutscenes, time doesn't pause. Oh, that's real nice. In case you didn't catch it, after the Bulborb ate a couple of my white Pikmin, a cutscene started and it began approaching me, so before I was physically able to react, the Bulborb had walked over and grabbed like 4 more of my white Pikmin in its mouth. Much worse things could have happened in that moment, but even still, the fact that some oversight like this even got into the game is kind of incredible. There's enough working against you as is, this is not helping anything. I will also never forgive that one floor in the Dream Den that has a bumbling snitch bug, craning dirigibug, and a puffy blowhog all within the immediate vicinity of each other. You wanna guess what happened to me? What a fun game. You do have the option of skipping a sub-level by simply waltzing over to the next sub-level entrance, but sometimes you'll notice that it's covered, meaning you have to bring your Pikmin all the way over to destroy it, and this floor had a hole cover. This game is a great patience tester. I really didn't like Pikmin 2 initially. Even still, I'm very mixed on it. If it wasn't for the absurd amount of caves, I would be fine with the game, but the repetitive gameplay loop makes this game feel so much longer than it has any right being. The caves are an interesting idea, but not enough is done with them. And actually, the game has a level-based challenge mode with extra caves to explore that sorta gave me what I was looking for. Every level is timed, so you have to look for a key to the next floor while also grabbing the treasures for a higher score. You're given different amounts of different Pikmin for each challenge as well, and on top of all of that, it supports co-op. The pacing on these levels is great, so I ended up enjoying these much more than the story mode caves. I really wish they got more experimental, but again, there's always Pikmin 4. I can understand why some love Pikmin 2, but I think some people get too defensive over it. The above ground areas are okay, still housing some fun puzzles, but you're encouraged to explore the caves, which are lacking in a lot of what I find fun in Pikmin. The new Pikmin types are cool. Except you. Bulbmen are goofy little fellas though. I don't want to see a single hate comment directed towards them. It would be so funny if Pikmin 4 brought them back. Please. I would say to give the game a try if you like the first, but temper your expectations. It can be a fun, but equally frustrating experience. The game has a lot of content though, so if you love it, then there's plenty more to do. I had some fun with 2, but I was very tired of it by the time the credits rolled. Pikmin 3 was my first Pikmin game. I think it was a Club Nintendo promotion where I got the game. Basically, if you registered Mario Kart 8 to your account, you would be eligible for one free game within a limited pool. There were some good options, but Pikmin 3 stuck out the most to me. Mostly because my family already owned different versions of the other games, but even still, I had always wanted to play Pikmin, and who's gonna say no to a free video game? I think it's kind of interesting how, for the longest time, most were in agreement that 3 is the best of the trilogy, but recently I've been seeing more people coming out and expressing their indifference towards it and saying that in many ways 2 is better. Which I don't know if I agree with that, but there's a lot to go over with 3, so let's dive in. Pikmin 3 focuses on a new group of explorers from the planet Kopai, which is on the verge of completely running out of food. Because of this, Kopai has been sending out countless unmanned research pods in hopes of finding another planet with edible food they can harvest seeds from to regrow and reinvigorate their planet. Eventually, they find a match in, coincidentally, the Pikmin planet. 3 explorers are then sent to scout out the planet to find the fruit it houses, but because this planet is cursed for some reason, something goes awry in the landing sequence, separating the crew from each other and their ship. Later, it's discovered that they've lost the ship's cosmic drive key, which is vital to their ability to return to Kopai. So, not only are they searching for fruit, but now the means to leave the planet safely. And now immediately you'll notice that Pikmin 3 has a larger focus on its story. Not to say it's very deep, but compared to the first 2 games, there's a lot more dialogue. Considering the nearly decade-long gap between the release of 2 and 3, I don't mind the tutorials much. They aren't excessive, although I do wish you were given the option to skip them on repeat playthroughs. I haven't felt the need to explain how the other games control because for the other games it's self-explanatory and works pretty well. Playing 3 after 1 and 2 was a bit awkward, I won't lie. You have a choice between Wiimote and Nunchuck, Wii U Pro Controller, and the Wii U Gamepad. I remember the Wii U Gamepad being the most comfortable, so that's what I started with, and I didn't like it. You can play with a fairly standard controller setup with the gamepad, although the cop pad apps such as the map are tied to the touchscreen as well as aiming, so you're encouraged to have one hand holding the gamepad while the other is using the stylus. When aiming, you're expected to aim and then double tap to throw your Pikmin at a target, but I didn't find it to be very responsive. Sometimes I would double tap and a Pikmin just wouldn't be thrown. The gamepad made the Armored Maw Dad, typically the most pathetic boss, into a frustrating fight. Had I remembered that you're now able to lock on to enemies and charge all of your Pikmin at them, I surely would have made less of a fool out of myself. Another new function is the cop pad, which shows you a map of the area with a pretty nifty overhead view on the TV screen. The map also has a go here function, making multitasking easier by allowing you to send your captains to other areas automatically. You have to keep an eye on them to make sure they aren't intercepted on the way, but this is exactly the kind of thing I would have loved to have had in Pikmin 2. Having 2 captains was good and all, but multitasking was somewhat inconvenient since you'd have to manually direct your captains to their destination, besides the fact that you were given little encouragement to do so with the day limit being cut. Pikmin 3 brings the day limit back, but in a brand new way. At the start of the game, you have free food provisions, with more being obtainable by collecting the planet's fruit for juicing. Not every fruit will fill up a whole cup, so you'll have to collect a healthy amount, which shouldn't be too hard since fruits are plentiful in this game. At the end of each day, any fruit you've collected will be tallied up, then juiced, and your total of provisions will be equal to the number of days you have left. Now I love this idea, but like I just mentioned, you're hardly ever under any amount of stress due to lack of days thanks to how many fruits you'll find. Later in the game, your juice gets stolen by Louie. I'm sorry? I like this part of the game, but it didn't give me much trouble either, even on my first playthrough. In Pikmin 2, there were too many treasures, which led to a lot of them being worth so little that I just sat there wondering what the point in it all was. 3 has somewhat of an opposite issue. The fruits are rewarding, but you can quickly build up a lot of juice, so the number of days you have left is never a fret. But I don't mind it. I love that the day limit returns, because I felt that I had some real encouragement to play more efficiently again, which is an aspect of Pikmin 1 that I dearly missed in 2. The addition of the go here function greatly helps us as well, because now more than ever, multitasking is at the forefront. Pikmin 3 is a much more linear game than 1 or 2 since it's less about collecting the game's equivalent to the ship parts or treasures, and more about progressing to and fighting an area's boss to move on to the next area. I can see where this would be disappointing to fans of the prior games, but I quite like the change of pace. It was very refreshing to jump back into after having played the second game twice in the span of a month. I can't say that the linear progression is more interesting than the open-endedness of the first game though. It's a sin to lie after all. I'll always love that aspect of Pikmin 1, and that is something that 3 largely lacks, the freedom of exploration and global progression. Being able to jump between areas to collect more ship parts that actively aid in your overall progression, rather than having to clear out areas in a certain order one by one, is great. I hardly felt the urge to revisit areas in 3 after their story purpose had run out, even though there are plenty of reasons to go back, more things to collect that is. I like that the extra content is there, don't get me wrong, but I hate that feeling of wasting a day in a Pikmin game, and going back to another area just to grab a fruit I couldn't before feels kinda like a waste to me. The change in progression is a double-edged sword, unfortunately. Speaking of big changes, take a look at this guy. I feel like in the game's conceptual phase, someone on the team put googly eyes on a rock and that's how this happened. Yeah, rock Pikmin. These guys, being rocks, are obviously more sturdy, so they're immune to squashing or stabbing based attacks. They're able to break the new crystals, which is endlessly satisfying. Rocks have a strong attack stat as well, something that I feel a lot of people may tend to overlook about them. The downside is that they're unable to latch onto enemies, so after the initial attack they'll do less damage since their attack rate is much lower than that of any other Pikmin. It feels like a slightly better balanced version of the purples. They're about as strong but not as consistent. Even still, they do a respectable amount of damage, and I'd hardly say they're broken like the purples were. We're also introduced to the cutest Pikmin in the entire franchise, which went extinct the moment I took my eyes off it. Huh. Winged Pikmin can fly, meaning water isn't an issue for them, most of the time. They are the weakest in combat, but they do have a crush resistance, and their ability to fly makes them particularly helpful for transporting fruits over hazards. Winged Pikmin may seem like the worst type at first, but I almost always kept them around since there are a number of points at which their flight paths for fruits or bridge pieces are shortcuts compared to using any other Pikmin. You want to take a wild guess at which Pikmin is really the weakest? How about the Pikmin you get well over halfway through the game and is only useful for one brief section? Blue Pikmin are the butt of every joke in this series. These poor dudes feel like they're only invalidated further with each new game, and Pikmin 4 looks to be continuing that trend with the new Ice Pikmin. The biggest issue I have with Blue Pikmin is that in every game their use is determined by what all there is in the water. Are there bridge pieces? A treasure maybe? Then you need the Blue Pikmin. This is fine, but like I said in the Pikmin 2 review, Blues have no other traits that make them helpful for exploration or combat, and nowhere is that more evident than in Pikmin 3. After defeating the Scornet Maestro and saving Captain Olimar, you're taken back to the Garden of Hope where he takes off with your food supply and commits a war crime because he's a silly little guy. Thanks to Louie's contraband, a new section of the Garden of Hope opens up, introducing us to our beloved blue friends. I like this section, but as soon as that bridge is built and you've beaten the Quaggled Mireclops, you're sent off to the Formidable Oak, aka the final area in the game. And worse yet, you don't need the blue Pikmin at all for this area. I'm sorry, what? What was even the point in including the blues in the story? I had forgotten how late in the game you actually obtain the blues. It's just kinda sad. Honestly, it feels like they cut out another area of the game that was meant to utilize the blues more. Either way, you can't tell me they're not the worst Pikmin when their utility is determined by how many bridge pieces or treasures are submerged in water, because when there isn't, you suddenly have no reason to ever bring them out. I feel like there's some untapped potential with the blues. It just feels like the devs didn't care to seek it out, considering they keep invalidating any useful trait they have with other Pikmin types. I hope Pikmin 4 gives them some greater purpose, but I have no reason to believe they won't continue this trend. Anyhow, the other returning Pikmin are of course the reds and yellows. Purples and whites don't return in the story mode, but they are in the mission mode, which is neat, although they've been nerfed quite a bit. One change made to the electric hazard for yellows is that it no longer insta-kills the other Pikmin types. Electric in general is a much less common hazard, meanwhile it was everywhere in 2. I guess I appreciate this change, although it didn't stop my Pikmin from dying in other increasingly stupid ways. In regards to the wildlife, it's kinda weird because I think I prefer the enemy designs in 2. It feels like they accentuated the weirdness of every creature in 2, whereas 3 doesn't have as much of that. Mamuda, the Dweevils, careening Dirigibug, heck, even the Emperor Bulblax was reduced to a regular enemy. A minor nitpick for sure, but something that disappointed me nonetheless. On the other hand, there's the bosses, which I loved. Armored Maudad is still pathetic though. Quaggled Myreclops is still my second fight in the game because of the sheer scope, and seeing this huge landmass monster towering over you, it's just enough to get the blood pumping. Scornet Maestro would probably be third on my ranking, but I love the attacker it has where it makes your Pikmin into hostages. More so, I love to hate it because the worried noises of the Pikmin struggling to escape the grasp of the Scornets is just so sad. And then there's the final boss, which is probably my favorite section of the entire game. I know it might seem weird to spoiler mark for a decade-old game, but just in case some new fans are coming across this series from Pikmin 4, skip ahead. Upon arriving in the formidable oak, you find the real Captain Olimar being looked after by a strange golden creature. Surprised by your approach, the creature, oh good heavens, it ate Olimar! Defeat it pretty quickly and it backs off, and now you have to bring him back to the ship. Only problem is that you can't use the geyser shortcut, so you'll have to find a new path inside the tree. This is where things get interesting. Inside the tree, the creature appears yet again to pursue Olimar, so using Brittany, you'll have to lead the Pikmin away from it and other harm while Alf and Charlie find another way back to the ship. Same idea as the Water Wraith in Pikmin 2, albeit much less threatening. The section starts off somewhat stressful since you're left very little room for Brittany to run in, but quickly more paths open up, which makes it far more manageable. Still, I love this section, and really that's one of my only issues with it, the difficulty and that it's so short. You don't see any other boss in the game that makes you multitask like this, nor any similar section in the game, so I kinda wish they asked a little more out of you, particularly through a slightly bigger challenge utilizing each Pikmin type. The second half of the boss, or the actual fight, is okay. With the first half, it feels like they're building up to something much bigger, but instead we get a vastly easier version of Pikmin 2's final boss. What we have is still very fun, but much like the rest of the game, it's a little too easy for its own good. Nonetheless, it's a very different way to cap off the experience, and if we could ever get something else like this but longer and with more of a challenge involved, I think we'd have something truly special. So at this point you might think I'm done yapping about the game, but there's still a little more content for me to squeeze out. In 2019, Pikmin 3 would get a deluxe port to Switch with several changes and additions being made to further streamline the experience. These days, deluxe is far and beyond my preferred way of playing free. The original just feels rough in comparison. Free Deluxe changes the controls for more clarity and convenience, most notably the lock-on and charging mechanic actually work well. Charging only charges the currently selected Pikmin, and locking on can be triggered much more easily. Holding Y will open up a swap menu if your captains are separated, and Pikmin behavior has seen a slight change as well in that when whistling them, they won't immediately drop their task to regroup. You'll have to whistle twice or slightly longer for them to rejoin you. It is a little bit annoying at times, but it also helps you avoid accidentally whistling the wrong Pikmin and your workflow getting all messed up. Other additions in Free Deluxe are the new Ultra Spicy difficulty, which isn't that spicy. I guess it's a good test of your management skills because you're limited to having 60 Pikmin out at one time, and the normally 18-minute days are cut to 13, but had I never heard that, I honestly wouldn't have noticed the difference between this and the regular difficulties. It might have been more interesting if each area got a slight remix, maybe having some different enemies in place of the ones that would normally be there. I don't know, I just don't think it provided the kind of challenge I was hoping for. We also get a lot of new content. Pikmin Free already has a mission mode with a bunch of different levels, but Free Deluxe adds in a ton of solid new ones following Olimar and Louie's side of the story leading up to the events of Pikmin Free. We get a couple of neat expedition logs explaining why they've returned and how Olimar ends up trapped again, and overall I quite like these levels. I know a lot of people love the mission mode in Free, but the time restrictions can be pretty tight, so I feel a lot more stress when playing them. Though that's kind of the idea, you have to play it once to get your bearings straight so that subsequent playthroughs can be spent effectively planning out each and every move you make, and when it clicks, it can be really fun and super satisfying to see everything going to plan. The side stories in Free Deluxe are the same idea with a different approach. Each level has a different objective, be it retrieving a ship piece, treasures, or clearing out out enemies. This is where it all clicked for me. These levels can be so addictive to learn inside and out to get that coveted platinum medal. If you found the story mode of Pikmin Free to be too lenient, I'd highly recommend checking out the mission mode and side stories because these are just peak Pikmin content. And there's also co-op and story mode now, which is freaking awesome even if I couldn't get any footage of it. So yeah, Pikmin Free is a very fun game. It's the most streamlined title up to this point, and with the deluxe port improving it even further, I'd say it's probably my favorite. Unless Pikmin 4 changes that. It's not without its issues though. The day limit is so lenient that you can stretch it out to day 99, blues are practically useless in story mode, and the progression is very linear. I've been seeing more people arguing against Pikmin Free recently, and I think there are plenty of fair points you can make against it, but I love it despite that. Do I wish the blues were more useful? Of course. Would I have wanted the game to have a greater difficulty? Sure. The overall package is such a solid game that I find incredibly fun to replay that I can ignore its issues because I don't feel like they actively hinder my experience. Pikmin pathfinding is at its best, multitasking is a larger part of the gameplay, bosses are creative and fun as well with the new Pikmin, and that's on top of all the extra content this game is packed with. Pikmin Free might not be exactly what fans of the prior entries would have wanted, but what we got is a game I still find myself coming back to after years, and that's everything I could have wanted from another Pikmin game. The Pikmin Trilogy is a very interesting one. For the longest time it went underlooked by most Nintendo fans, and yet it kept coming back. Each game offers such a familiar yet different, fun, creative RTS experience that they're all still worth giving a look. Pikmin 1 is clunky, but hidden under the jank is a surprisingly solid title that might not have much content but is replayable enough to get you your money's worth. Pikmin 2, though I may not like it as much, has many improvements over the first game that improve the core gameplay. 2 has some cool ideas, but I don't think the full potential is ever found in them, so we're left with a game that feels sort of half-baked. Pikmin Free brings even more improvements to the table, but drastically changes the pacing in some positive but doubly negative ways, affecting its difficulty and replayability for many. I love that the Pikmin series is getting more attention with the release of 4, and I can only hope that it brings even more improvements, charm, replayability, and overall fun memories that the rest of the series has for me. I have some high hopes for Pikmin 4, so I've been Wyrlwind, thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe and look out for my Pikmin 4 review, which will hopefully come out soon.